Hello and welcome to Who Needs Western Civ, a podcast about liberal arts and classical education. I'm Clay Green, and today I'm joined by Carlos Eire. Carlos Eire is the T. Laurison Riggs Professor of History and Religious Studies at Yale University. He's a world-renowned expert in late medieval and early modern Europe. He previously taught at St. John's University and the University of Virginia. He is the author of numerous articles and books, but I will single out his two memoirs, Waiting for Snow in Havana and Learning to Die in Miami. Waiting for Snow won the National Book Award in nonfiction and has been translated into more than a dozen languages. When I attended Yale, he was a cherished advisor and mentor, and I'll add that he's probably the kindest man I know. And I say that not just because you gave me distinction on my orals, Carlos, but
Yeah, don't do that for everyone. That's something that many students have not realized.
well,
Except the ones that don't get distinction too. For sure.
You probably just had pity on me. That's my guess.
No, not at all.
Well, thank you for being here. I really appreciate it, Carlos.
My pleasure.
So I know a little bit about your background, and maybe some of the listeners do or don't. I'm especially curious for the sake of this discussion about your educational background. But if you want to make a comment as well about your fascinating life story, you're welcome to. But maybe you could just say a little bit about what kind of education in what we call Western Civ you had in school, post-secondary or otherwise.
Yeah, well, I graduated from high school in 1969. So that kind of tells you a lot there already. And at my high school in Chicago, which was enormous, there was an honors track. I was lucky enough to be part of that. But every year, also, and it wasn't just because I chose these classes, but every year that I was there, I had at least a course in Western civilization, and also one course, entire year, junior year, was American history from 17th century to the present. And my senior year, it wasn't Western civilization that from beginning to present, it was really modern European history. But basically, Western civilization, Western values, and so on. But it was a public high school, so we didn't have philosophy. We didn't have courses on intellectual history or the intellectual heritage of the West. And of course, when I got to college, I already felt I didn't need to take Western Civ over again. So I just started working on every period, European and Latin American history. I skipped North American history, which I could have taken courses in, but I felt I'd already gotten the basic knowledge I needed in that honors. No, actually, it was advanced placement high school class. Mm-hmm. So I also took, my university didn't have minors, but if they had minors, I could have easily claimed a minor in philosophy. And my double major was history and theology. So I moved from, public high school with Western history to a Catholic university with plenty of courses on the Catholic traditions. So it was pretty solid by the time I got to graduate school, or so I thought. Yes, surprise, surprise. I barely knew anything. But
yeah, we know a lot as seniors, and we don't know quite as much as first-year graduate students.
Yes, that's true. I think that I intentionally chose not to stray too far from Western or European history. Not just because of work seriously in any other area, you need so many other languages.
Right.
I decided to stay with familiar territory. And also that's what I wanted to do. Always very conscious of the significance and importance of Western values, and not just because I attended a Catholic university for my bachelor's degree or Yale for a graduate degree. That was my preference. But I realized the value of all this for civilization because I was born in Cuba and lived through the so-called Cuban Revolution and had to flee. And I've lived under communist totalitarianism, which rejects the Western heritage, right, and turns everything into class conflict. Lately, they seem to have shifted over to racial conflict or privilege conflict rather than class. But I saw everything thrown out the window, including all the freedoms that we have in the United States, which have sprung out of the heritage of Western civilization, such as freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and so on and so forth. Democracy, all of it cast away in a totalitarian regime that immediately when I read George Orwell, I was very familiar with everything he was describing in 1984 and also in Animal Farm. I lived in 1984 twice, because the second time I lived in the year 1984. So I have an extra appreciation for these values that I know what happens when they are tossed away.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great setup. And do you think that we do an adequate job of teaching those values either to undergraduates or high schoolers or graduate students? Do you think we teach those to graduate students at all?
I don't think it's the norm longer. It stopped being the norm maybe about 20 years ago. And with every passing year, it's increasingly less and less so the norm. I really don't know what students are being taught now in elementary school through high school, but my own children, who are now 35, 33, and 29, they did not receive a very good education in Western history, Western civilization, and certainly zero on traditional values of Western civilization. So I could tell that. And it's odd, they also had some really ancient textbooks that they were using. I know when they all went to the same grade school, so every third grade, I got to see the same book brought home, copyright 1963. And it was about the European exploration of the world. So you would think that there was something there that was, but the book was so terribly lopsided. It left out three of the nations that did a lot of exploring, barely got any attention. Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands. It was all the English and French who had basically, quote unquote, discovered most of the world.
Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands they were there first almost before. Yeah.
Nothing in that book. But oddly enough, 1963, and the public school system was still using it.
Well, people have written very bad books in all decades.
Yes, that's true. It's as you grow up and you remember what you were taught in high school and grade school, you sometimes discover that the information was totally wrong or lopsided.
Hmm.
And that has not changed. That seems to be a constant problem. I don't know I went to one of what was considered one of the best schools in Havana, and I can honestly say that I had a medieval education. It was a Catholic school. Oh,
Yeah.
very rigorous, very strict. And funny thing is that we were told these very, very scary stories in religion class. And when I was in graduate school, I picked up this book by Caesarius of Heisterbach, a 13th century Cistercian monk. It's a collection of stories of precisely scary things that can happen to people if they don't behave correctly. And some of the stories I was told I found in Caesarius of Heisterbach.
Wow.
Why I can claim that I had a medieval education.
That's amazing. Wow. Yeah. Well, despite having a medieval education, you went on to study the Renaissance or the Reformation or the Reformations. That would be the Catholic and Protestant Reformations, the early modern period. Do you have a preferred term, by the way, for what we should call this?
But, the terms have morphed during my lifetime, as you well know. But no, I in high school, I fell in love with the whole idea of the Renaissance.
Oh, so that started back a ways back.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, like sophomore year in high school. I had not, I think maybe we had been taught about the Renaissance in 6th grade, maybe in 7th grade, but it wasn't until I was a sophomore in high school that I got to read a fuller account of what it was trying to do as a movement, which was to reshape society according to ancient tried and true values, which had been not discarded necessarily, but forgotten or overlaid with so much interpretation that they had ceased to matter. Because I had always had this kind of, I don't know, romantic notion of what classical civilization was. That was actually my first love in history, was that period.
Yeah.
So then when I discovered that there were people in the 15th century who tried to revive it, oh, I thought that was so good, so exciting. So I started liking it more and more and more. So much so that by the time I got to graduate school, I knew that that's what I wanted to specialize in.
For you, was were ideas principally behind that? Or I know that when I took art history in high school, I am already prepared for medievalists to wince at this, but you have this experience where, you study the classical art, Phidian drapery, all that great sculpture, and then it's,
yes,
it's a dark age, and then, Giotto, and it becomes just this incredibly beautiful painting. So was the art a part of it for you as well?
Yeah, I think so. Definitely. Although I always had great fondness for, even in grade school, for Gothic architecture.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
So I knew that everything was not dark. As a matter of fact, I remember this is sometime in 1963, back to that very same year. I was watching Walt Disney's Wonderful World of Color. It was always on Sundays. And they were doing a very quick clip on Western civilization, like maybe Western civilization in 5 minutes or something.
Wow.
And then there was the fall of the Roman Empire. And then the screen went black. And the narrator said, and then came the Dark Ages. And then suddenly 2 eyes appeared, cartoon type eyes in the black.
Was it Petrarch?
Pardon?
The eyes of Petrarch?
Perhaps, yeah, because that was the Renaissance. People opened their eyes and dispelled all the darkness.
Yeah.
And even at that age, I thought, no, that's not right.
Yeah.
Not entirely.
Yeah, and
Anyway,
it isn't, but something does happen in the Renaissance. You
oh,
think? Yeah,
definitely. And I have actually, all of us at some point in our life, when we have these moments that are really life changing because they bring so many things into perspective. And these moments for me have always been unexpected. And the moment I want to refer to is I was in Florence, Italy, the cradle of the Renaissance. But I'd gotten tired of the museums in Florence after like 3 or 4 days. So I went up to this beautiful town that's outside Florence, Fiesole,
yeah, of
which is up
course.
on a mountain, a little mountain.
Where Galileo was
Yeah,
exiled to.
yes, it's a beautiful town. And it has a beautiful Roman theater, an outdoor theater that was in such good shape. Of course, I think maybe, a little work has been done on it, but basically, this Roman stuff just lasts forever. So there were also these very crude stone structures along the perimeter of the theater. So like behind the highest seats on the theater, because then it's a sloping theater like the ancient Greek theaters. Anyway, I'm sitting on this crude stone slab, which I imagine must have been pre-Etruscan because it was so crude.
Wow.
But along comes a tour guide with two tourists. He was giving a private tour, and the tour was in English. And he points to the stone slab on which I was sitting, and he says, and this here is a barbarian tomb. Oh, my head exploded. Oh, it's post-Roman.
Oh,
But
wow.
then the two tourists who were German asked him in English, what kind of barbarians? And he said, I don't know. But he wheeled north and pointed north and says, but they came from over there. And then he muttered under his breath, I heard him in Italian, Longobardi, Lombard.
Got it.
He knew exactly what kind of barbarians, but he just wanted to point out to these two German tourists, I think, it's your ancestors.
Yeah.
But boy, that contrast just brought everything into high relief for me. It was beautiful, just beautiful.
That's amazing. Now that we're on the subject of Rome, I'll put a question to you that I asked Paul Friedman, who I know you know, when he was on this podcast. I saw this recent little social media craze, not sure what the right word would be, that apparently men think about the Roman Empire every day. This is what there was some study or something that has been mangled into this. Let's put aside the men part of it, but why do you think anybody would think about the Roman Empire every day? Is that just silly, or?
No, it's not silly. I think obviously, if that study was taken recently, then the history of the Roman Empire is still being told. Maybe not in school, maybe the History Channel or
Yeah,
some cable channel.
yeah. I think you can still get Hitler in Rome,
Yes,
and aliens. That's what's on the History Channel.
yes, yeah. And lately it's also this theory about the Younger Dryas period and civilizations older
Ooh,
than Babylon.
yeah,
But that's
that's a strange one.
it's taking Hitler's place.
Oh no, Hitler's been displaced for it's like an ancient prehistoric civilization or something.
Yes, because they have been discovering for the past 2 decades these ruins in Turkey, specifically Eastern Turkey,
Yeah,
northern Syria, sort of area, that are 12 to 11,000 years old. And there's no doubt about it. These are, made by humans, and there was enough stuff left behind to be carbon dated. So from the stuff that can be carbon dated, they have figured out these ruins are at least 12,000 years old. And they have stone pillars that are as large as the ones in Stonehenge. But unlike Stonehenge, they have carvings on them, 3D carvings. So it's thrown everything into everything that we knew about the beginnings of civilization. It's thrown them into question. But I think one reason that men might think about Rome is because, you see these things, especially on these historical programs, that everything that Rome built has lasted a very, very long time. And of course, people who live in Western Europe run into these ruins all the time. And Americans don't unless they travel to Europe. But this idea of a civilization that can build things that last for millennia and that controlled so much territory for so many centuries, it just kind of appeals to some kind of subliminal thing I think that men might have about power and conquest and permanence. I think that's the key issue, I think, for me anyway, is the permanence of the Roman Empire that it inspires adoration on the part of people, and not just men, but
there's in the Aeneid, there's that kind of deeply worshipful, reverential attitude toward the empire itself, and this understanding the empire is going to last forever. And we've heard a lot about in history about empires that will last forever, but the thing about that, of course, is while the Roman Empire had existed in pretty substantial form for a little while, a couple centuries maybe, being a big powerful empire, not having an imperial governorship, but being an empire. After the Aeneid, we now know the Roman Empire was just getting started. It had, almost 5 more centuries after that. And that's a truly almost unimaginable. I mean, that starts to feel like forever, almost like eternity or something like that.
Yes.
Hundreds on hundreds on hundreds of years.
And if you consider the survival of the Eastern Roman Empire,
right,
called Byzantine,
which goes a solid 1,000 years after that.
Yes, 1,000 years. And I can't remember which pope it was. Some medieval pope received a delegation, early medieval. This is before the division of churches, East and West. Some delegates from Constantinople, and he in some document he listed them as Greeks, and they were so insulted.
They're the Romans.
Yes, they called themselves Romans, and he said, "Look at these barbarians." I know it was probably 9th century. The audacity of these barbarians calling us Greeks. Yes. Well, that's how far East and West had gone their separate ways. But
I share with you your sort of romantic idea about classical civilization. That's always in the back of my head. And I too am pleased to hear that, it seems like some amount of that is persistent, that young people today might still have a little bit of that, even if they don't have it, if they don't all have it. I worry if that were lost.
Well, I would worry too. What I don't know at all, because I no longer have children in school, is, in the lower grades, how this Roman imperialism is being portrayed. and not that it needs to be bashed for being as cruel as it was.
Yeah, it was bloody business for
It
sure.
was horrible. It was awful.
Yeah.
But if that is all that is being emphasized, then the most important part of that heritage is being lost. I always tell my students, when trying to explain the origins of Christian monasticism, what do you think these people wanted to flee the world? And why was the world such a bad place? Yeah, well, just consider all of these factors, the cruelty, the slavery, the circus, men killing each other for sport, so on and so forth. Anyone would want to get away from those things. But ironically, it was those very same monks that kept Roman and Greek civilization alive after the Western Empire collapsed. If it weren't for them, so much would have been lost. So they fled the world and at the very same time preserved the best things about that world.
Yeah. What do you think is the significance? Here's one of those big questions that historians never totally comfortable with. What do you think is the significance of the fact that for Western Europe, we basically have a civilization that grew up in the ruins or the shadow of the Roman Empire, and then of course in the East they had a civilization that thought of itself as a continuity with the Roman Empire? What do you think it does that there's that attitude of, or that vague feeling that before now they could build really great stuff? They were, right. If you see what I'm getting at.
No, and marvel at it, because many could not understand how it was possible or how it had been done. But the Eastern Empire, which I call the continually shrinking empire. If you look at it, with every century, just kept getting smaller and smaller.
Yeah, it basically just becomes the Balkans at some point.
Yeah. And they were overtaken by others, but mostly by Muslim civilization. And the reasons for that are very complex, but that continuity did not help them maintain the same level of, let's call it, vigor or strength. And they kept building nice things. They didn't lose it, but it didn't help them much. At the end, 1453, when Constantinople was the last remaining little tiny sliver of the empire, the Turks had cannons that made mincemeat out of their very good walls. And they were overtaken, and that was it. But the continuity didn't help them. That's why sometimes continuity is not enough, not by itself.
Interesting.
Meanwhile, those barbarian Franks, and the even more barbarian Vikings, they just changed everything where the old Roman Empire used to be. And well, as they say, the rest is history. Here we are.
Yeah. So when we're thinking about that history, it can be hard to keep in mind the values that you were talking about before. Where do you think the values come from in that history? The values like, you mentioned freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of worship. Do you think all of that has its roots in the period we were talking about before, the Renaissance, the Reformation, or the modern period? Or do you think you can find it throughout? Or where do you think the values really begin to come out?
The specific values I mentioned that were thrown out in my native land are modern values. but they have deep roots that go back to classical civilization as well as early Christianity, or Christianity from that same time as the Roman Empire. But they're really modern and came into being in the time of the Reformations, gradually, slowly. And I always see it, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, those three. And then democratic values. Those stem from the deep religious divisions created by the Reformations, which created societies in which there were, competing visions of what was true. And the 17th century was horrific in terms of intra-religious conflict. And as you well know, England, it was one of the worst.
Terrible. I mean,
absolute worst.
Country kept butchering itself and coming apart, and yeah, it was hideous.
So the same thing for the Dutch, same thing in Germany, and also France to a considerable extent, where you had Protestants and Catholics in close proximity to each other, attacking each other with equal vigor. What a mess. Well, how can we get out of this? How can we carry on daily business? I think it was a practical solution. But the practical solution had intellectual cornerstones on which it could be built. And that's the key, and especially Greek philosophy and Greek ideas of democracy and the Greek philosophical quest for truth still being respected. Yes, you can search for truth, but don't kill your neighbor if your neighbor's got a different truth. Is a modern thing. That's very modern. And that's part, but it's all, you can't understand that without understanding what preceded it. So therefore the whole picture is what's necessary in order for one to be cognizant of where these values came from and what those values have done to transform so much of the world. But it's still an uphill struggle. The UN Declaration of Human Rights, for instance, inconceivable without that modern Western heritage of toleration and of the value of human life, which actually also has, deep ancient Christian roots, more so than Roman roots.
Right.
The value of the individual is a very Christian principle. And actually many people don't know this, but one of the chief writers involved in crafting the UN Declaration of Human Rights was the French Catholic philosopher Jacques Maritain. Had a profound influence on the writing of that document. And it's not a Christian document, it's not a religious document. That's the beauty of it.
Right.
It's the very concept voiced by Thomas Jefferson. We hold these truths to be self-evident, right? The self-evident nature of these truths. That's a very fragile conception, immensely fragile. And we can see it in our own day, how it's getting pecked to death. Especially because, I think in our day and age, the nations that have inherited the Western heritage, many people, intellectuals and non-intellectuals alike, have grown very impatient with contradictions and paradoxes. So the fact that Thomas Jefferson owned slaves, yet wrote that phrase in the minds of many, cancels out not just the value of that phrase, but the truth itself that is being announced in that passage. What can't be true? Look at this man. Look what he was doing. Yeah, he thought it was self-evident, but he was only talking about white settlers. Oh my God.
He wasn't only talking about white settlers.
Of course not. Of course
Yeah.
not. He wasn't, you know.
No. He knew that he understood the contradiction there.
But he also had something that the West seems to have lost, which is patience.
Yeah.
Knowing that substantial change rarely happens overnight, that changes take time, and that actually we can aim for perfection, but perfection ultimately is impossible. But all kinds of perfection in any aspect of human life and human creativity, perfection always eludes us. But you can't get close to perfect unless you aim for perfect. And I think Jefferson and the founding fathers were very aware of that. And they were also very painfully aware of how many ways human beings can undermine their own best interests. And you need to set up checks and balances precisely for that reason.
Yeah, I share your feeling that sense could be being lost. That opening of well, it's not quite the opening, but that piece of the Declaration of Independence that's so famous is one of those sentences that since childhood, and I wonder whether it's some magic in the words themselves or the way it was taught to me or the truths it conveys. It's one of those sentences that always brings a chill to my spine, along with, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That sentence from the Declaration always, it never loses its power to affect me.
And you were born here.
Yeah.
Right? But I have a special appreciation for it because I know what happens when that vision is lost. Or worse, it's not just lost, but it's outlawed.
Yeah.
It's outlawed and replaced with, totalitarianism.
But don't the Marxists think of themselves as serving or pushing forward equality and freedom?
Oh, yes. Of course they think that, but they do it in such a way that it becomes impossible to achieve that. And the reason for it is this. You do away with private property, which is another one of these principles that emerged out of the 17th and 18th century. Actually, it's a much older concept, but defending it and the necessity of private property for the establishment of democratic societies. Pick up any English or French political thinker from the 18th, 19th century, you're going to find private property being brought up constantly.
Right.
Problem with socialism is that it declares that everything should be equally shared. But that's inhuman. It's inhuman because it's unrealistic. We human beings, we're still, very self-centered. We're not angels. And in order to enforce total equality, which is what Marxism aims for, in order to enforce that total equality, that total selflessness, you have to force people. So you have to use violence, actually. You have to resort to violence to ensure that sharing. And of course, the sharing never takes place in a full way because there's always somebody in control. The people who write the laws and enforce the laws, they live much better than everybody else. So, as they used to say in the Soviet Union, and still say in most communist societies, because the government, if the government owns everything, and there's no hope of advancing yourself because everyone has to be equal. The saying goes like this: that they pretend to pay us, and we pretend to work. Because no one gets paid enough for their efforts. Or actually, if you pay everyone exactly the same, for instance, it will always be the case that some people will be much better at accomplishing what needs to be accomplished, just because of the unevenness of how gifts are spread out among humans. And some will end up at the top, and most will not. And they will not be paid enough, which means people have no initiative to improve things, or may actually be blocked from improving things if they come up with a better idea than the people at the top. And that's why there's always been lack of just about everything in socialist countries. I still remember walking into a store in the former Yugoslavia in 1983. And I was astounded, even though I had lived in Cuba, right? So I'd known what it was like to live in a communist socialist state. But in Cuba, what happened is that all the goods disappeared and nothing came in. So the stores were empty. But in Yugoslavia, which was one of the most successful of the Soviet satellites, I walked into a large department store. It had several floors. Each floor had one product. So I still remember there was one entire floor of the store was nothing but toasters, because that's what had been made in the factories the past month, I guess, right? And another floor was bicycles and so on and so forth. So there was, and it was all the same model too. You didn't have a choice. So that's not ultimately that's not good for the people.
Yeah.
Although someone might say, "Oh, but that guarantees that everyone has a toaster." No, it doesn't guarantee that, because some people won't have enough money to buy that toaster because it's usually very expensive. So
your previous comment about the inevitability that those who are controlling the economy will end up much better off and much better off than ordinary people reminds me of that saying from Animal Farm: all animals are created equal, or all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others.
I love that line because it is so true. And Orwell had seen it all up close, especially during the Spanish Civil War, where he was in the communist occupied areas. Plus, he also knew a lot about the Soviet Union and what was happening there at the very same time. So he knew the process described in Animal Farm, of the animals taking over the farm, kind of a mirror of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. That's what happened, and that's what happened in my country. Exactly, step by step. So many people don't know this because many people think that Che Guevara was an altruist who cared greatly for the poor. But he took over a mansion in Havana. People who had fled the country and left this huge mansion took up almost an entire city block with very nice gardens. It was only 3 blocks from my house.
Wow.
And I and my friends used to go over there, see if we could see the great Che exiting through the gates in his chauffeur-driven Mercedes-Benz. We not only wanted to see Che, but we also wanted to ask the guards for bullets. Hey, bullets! Can you give us some bullets? Yeah, and they would. And then we'd take hammers to the bullets and see if we could make them explode and shoot the bullet out. So Che Guevara, actually, an Argentine woman came up to me after a talk I gave in New York last week. She said, "Did you ever get to see Che?" And I told her precisely this story. She was horrified. She was horrified. She either thought I was lying or I had just burst her bubble. But her jaw dropped when I saw her. Oh, that can't be true. Are you sure? Yes. I'm an eyewitness.
There's such a mythology around Castro, but especially Che Guevara. It must drive you crazy.
It does drive me insane, especially because he directly and through the orders he gave to his men, tortured and killed members of my family. And he was in charge of all executions.
Wow.
And he also loved, after men were shot with a firing squad, of course, they don't always die immediately. Because they don't, the bullet doesn't, it's not like, even though you've got 10 men shooting at one man or 3 men, it's not every case that the bullet hits the heart and kills the person instantly. So
usually they don't load all the guns too, right? Usually, right. Yeah.
So that no one can be sure ultimately that they killed somebody.
Right.
But Che loved him to take this duty upon himself, to go up to the men who had been shot and to blow their brains out with a pistol. And he did it every time. So it has been recorded by many, many eyewitnesses.
Why is it you think that the some of the Spanish American or Latin American countries went in this direction? Famously, of course, Marx said that it would be the bourgeois parliamentary democracies isn't the right word, but parliamentary societies of Europe that would find communism and socialism. But as it turns out, it's been countries in Latin America, Russia. Why do you think Latin American countries have had that experience? Or would you correct some part of what I said? That would be fine.
Oh, it's a great promise to make, total equality that eventually leads to a fair and just society, blah, 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 blah. But it's an unachievable goal. So in places that have high poverty rates, as is true of much of South America and Central America, and other countries in the third world, it seems attractive. But I always laugh because when the actual history of communist socialist countries is brought out, the brutality that has been required to aim for those goals in those specific countries, and we have the record, quite often Marxists will say, oh, but they weren't going about it the right way. They weren't really, they're not good Marxists. So you have also the phrase of the revolutions eating their own is another feature of Marxist revolutions, is that just as in Christian history, there are battles over orthodoxy.
Right.
And over who has the correct interpretation of what Marxism is. Just as Christians argued, who has the right interpretation of who Christ was. what he had to say. It's like a religion.
Right.
Which brings me to my other historical point concerning the ideals of socialism have been achieved in human history. They have. By monks and nuns who take vows of poverty. And it hasn't always worked, but in many cases it has. And it has also worked among a group of that issued out of the radical Reformation in the 16th century, the Hutterites, who are still around. There are plenty of them in Western Canada, for instance. The Hutterites shared property. And unlike monks and nuns, they're not celibate. They actually marry and have children, families. But they're very successful farmers. Their cooperatives are very, very successful. So successful that they end up usually gobbling up their neighbors' lands because they outproduce them. But see, that's voluntary. It's not enforced. Voluntary communism can work very beautifully, but enforced communism never does or never has in human history.
I think about what, for instance, Stalin was willing to sacrifice. I don't even want to say sacrifice because it wasn't his own that he was giving up, but the lives that he was willing to throw away, millions, for the sake of the elimination of private property, capitalism in the countryside of the Soviet Union. I mean, especially, what happened in Ukraine.
And Mao.
Just horrifying. Yeah, and Mao too. Yeah.
The Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, the story repeats itself.
Yeah.
And
it has the sound of fanaticism.
There's one thing I've discovered as I've aged, and given the subjects that I teach, is that political ideology and religious ideology have the same structure. It's different belief systems, but they are belief systems that, whenever enforced on an entire population, never work and actually lead to plenty of cruelty. And case in point would be the Spanish Inquisition in the 16th and 17th century. The Reign of Terror in the French Revolution. Reign of Terror was worse than the Spanish Inquisition. But
it's faster too.
Oh yeah, a lot quicker. Yes.
Yeah.
It was over just in a few years. The Spanish Inquisition lasted till 1834.
But it wasn't always the Spanish Inquisition that we think of, right? It didn't.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, the last 3 decades, so much work has been done on the Inquisition, dealing with the real documents.
Yeah.
It has been proved. It wasn't as horrible,
right,
as it was thought to be.
Weren't they the first organization in Western Europe to stop prosecuting witches?
Yes. And they went after pedophiles, and they also went after priests who sexually abused people. Those are 3 aspects of the Inquisition that make it very modern.
Yeah,
very, very modern. Of course, they went after many other people unfairly and unjustly, but for a while there, they would go through phases of who was being brought in and what crimes they were prosecuting. But yes, pedophilia, and what they called the abuse of the confessional, sexual predation by priests on people who were confessing their sins, and usually leading to sexual abuse.
17th century Me Too.
Yes. And
wow. Yeah, I had no idea about that.
Yeah, who would have ever thought, this quote unquote monstrous institution could also achieve these goals of cleansing society from predators. Actually, I had a student in a class, a seminar, maybe 6-7 years ago, who did a paper on the Spanish Inquisition and its prosecution of pedophiles. He went into it thinking that he was going to discover that what was being persecuted was homosexuality, right? And that it was homophobia. But no, and what he found out was that in just about every case that was tried for this crime, there was a huge age difference between the person being prosecuted and their victims. So there was that imbalance. I wouldn't want the Inquisition resurrected as a means of tackling these problems, but tackle them they did. Yeah.
That's fascinating. And, the other aspect that the Inquisition is famous for is doctrinal religious policing, hunting out converted or unconverted Jews. And, I think we don't need the Inquisition to have that inquisitorial attitude in our society. I think it's already very much present. Would you agree?
Oh, yes, very much so. And, especially with, the sexual abuse issue. I was in a department meeting at Yale where we were encouraged to keep an eye on each other and report on each other if we saw any signs of sex abuse going on.
Now, there's certainly a positive side to that. I mean, I think, we know that at Yale and at other places, there was perhaps a lot of, playing around with grad students and stuff that used to go on.
Oh, it was terrible.
But the keeping an eye on each other,
yes, part that made
and there are other kinds of grievance lines and things like this that do encourage, especially in universities, a creepy atmosphere.
Oh, very much so. And telling on each other for thought crimes.
Yeah, right.
Saying the wrong thing can
run
into an awful lot of trouble.
Right.
As happened at Yale during Halloween a few years ago.
Yeah, with the Christakuses.
Right. Who dared, I think it was the Yale Daily ran, that's the student newspaper, ran an article on what were the proper or improper Halloween costumes.
Right.
And someone dared to write a letter to that newspaper and say, you're all adults now. You can choose your costumes. Don't let anybody tell you. Oh, and then there was this huge explosion. Not literally, but hundreds of students descended on.
It's not 1969 anymore. We don't have huge explosions on college campuses.
No, but we do have mobs actually.
Yes,
surrounding the professor's house.
Right.
Chanting insults at him and his wife.
Right.
Which is
I remember one time I was teaching in the English building at Yale, teaching my little writing course, Lindsley Chittenden it's called. And in the middle of my class, students were coming through the halls banging trash can lids together, shouting "climate strike." And I have nothing against awareness of the environment, trying to improve the climate, but I wanted to say, I give in. All right, I promise I'll fix the climate.
Yeah.
You're just interrupting these students' education. I was very frustrated.
Very expensive education too.
Indeed. And when it's me, that who knows? They're probably not getting their money's worth anyway.
Well, yeah. Anytime that I see ideological purity being insisted upon, I get very nervous.
Yeah. And it can take a variety of forms and structures. And, this is something that I think could be a reason to return to the founding principles of America. Some of these things we talked about coming out of the 16th and 17th centuries. There's a reason why freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech were won out, because when you ask everybody to sign the oath of supremacy like Henry VIII did, you can split the social order right open. And in many ways, it's much wiser to let people, for the sake of social peace, but I think also just because it's the right thing to do, the virtuous thing to do, to let people be the guardians of their own beliefs.
And prime example are the Dutch had 60 years of on and off warfare trying to liberate themselves from Spanish rule, and also to liberate themselves from Spanish Catholic rule. But there was it's a very small country, and people are tightly packed, and it was religiously divided with Catholics and Protestants. And which nation in Europe was the first to have actually real practice, not theory, but practice of religious toleration?
Netherlands.
The Netherlands, yes.
Yeah.
And they kept doing business with each other. And I don't say that to be sarcastic, but carrying on business as usual, people realized it's a solution. Stop killing each other, and you keep doing business, and live and let live as much as possible. They still discriminated against anyone who wasn't Calvinist in the Netherlands for quite some time. But Catholics could have mass. They just couldn't have a church building. They had to have their mass inside some other building that didn't look like a church and had the entrance in the back. Right? But they could still remain Catholic. And that's, again, back to that principle of slow evolution of change. Eventually, yes, they were allowed to build their own churches. But what I love about the Dutch is that they started out their battle against Spain and Catholicism by destroying religious images. But soon enough, they realized they were destroying valuable things. And at a certain point, they started taking them down very carefully and selling them to Catholics.
I would be remiss if I didn't bring up at this point Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice. There's a very famous there's a very famous essay by Alan Bloom about the Merchant of Venice. Famous not among his Shakespeareans. Shakespeareans don't like this essay, but I like this essay. It's about the Merchant of Venice, and it's about Venice is a kind of multicultural, multi-religion society. And of course, when you start thinking about the play that way, you see pretty quickly that it's not a positive vision of what that looks like. That ethnic, religious conflict is somewhat inevitable. Bloom says Shakespeare tends to think. And then more than that, there's a way in which religion itself can go up for sale. The merchants Salario and Solanio are thinking about their ships when they're in church. They're the Lancelot Gobbo is afraid that people are going to, we're going to have Jewish women like Jessica converting to Christianity, and it's going to raise the price of pork in Venice. And I wonder if you think there is something to that problem that, when you subject religious things to the marketplace, you can cheapen them or turn them into mere commodities. Maybe not all the way in Marx's sense, but
Definitely.
When I was growing up, it was all the what would WWJD bracelets that people I knew had.
Yes. And like anything else, religion can be monetized.
Yeah.
Right. And one of the more sort of shocking experiences I had concerning this issue was this is the 1980s. Suddenly there was an Albanian Orthodox church in Chicago that had a weeping image of the Virgin Mary.
Wow.
And of course, all the newspapers reported, and the line went around the block to get into this church to see the weeping icon. I went, but they were charging admission. Of course, it was suggested, right?
Yes.
That it was a donation.
It's a donation, right?
But yes, the image was weeping. I saw it.
Yeah.
But I didn't know what to make of it because I'd read so many stories about these images being constructed in the past with some mechanism in the back that, a little tiny hole is all you need in the canvas for the water to come through. So
what was it that Erasmus said, that there were enough pieces of the true cross in Europe to build a galleon or something?
Yeah, he said, despite the fact that it was carried by one man, there are now enough pieces of the true cross to build a ship. Yes. Yep. And then Calvin copied that joke word for word without a footnote. I think it might have been a pretty popular saying.
Before Erasmus?
Yeah, I think it might.
Okay, that makes sense. I'll never forget in your class, you said, I think you were quoting a student. There's a popular formulation. Erasmus laid the egg that Luther hatched.
Right.
And I think one of your students put it, Erasmus laid the egg that Luther scrambled.
Yes.
Something like this.
I can't take credit for it. And I think I saw a moment of genuine invention.
Yeah.
In the classroom.
Yeah, that happens.
And it was beautiful. It was absolutely beautiful. I wish I'd had like some kind of medal. I could instantly. It's too late now because my teaching career is almost over. I should have manufactured medals to give to students when moments like this occurred. I should have thought of this. And then, just give them the medal and then take it back. I'll take it to a jeweler and inscribe it with the student's name and the neologism or whatever it is that they came up with.
I had a student paper. You'll see that this is a different kind of story, but I had a student paper that began Beowulf is a novel by William Shakespeare. And I want to get that. I want to get a tattoo that says that.
Oh, wow. Yeah, well, yes. After you've been teaching for a while, you'll be able to amass a pretty thick notebook with mistakes of this sort. Yes, I had one that William the Conqueror was killed and defeated at the Battle of Hastings.
That really adds insult to injury that they both killed and defeated it.
So my comment on the margin was, "Oh, is this why he's called the Conqueror?"
Yeah, he was killed and defeated, and yeah, somehow he ended up ruling England for decades.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Ghost King, something like this.
I also had said that St. Francis of Assisi went around naked all the time. I don't know
where they got that from.
It's because he took his clothes off in front of his father and the bishop to renounce the world, right? But he only did it once. But that's
yeah, it stuck with the student, though. Was this a Yale student?
I'm trying to think. No, it was
okay.
Virginia student.
Okay, yeah. Well, speaking of Thomas Jefferson, they're not keeping up the the traditions.
William the Conqueror, that was a Yale student.
Wow, William the Conqueror was both killed and defeated. Yeah, that's something special. Maybe a closing question as we wind things down here. What do you think is the hope for the teaching of Western civilization or great books or really these values in either the universities or outside the universities today? Is there any reason for optimism?
Well, I think there is because, well, two things. One, the students themselves at Yale gravitate a good number. Let me put it differently. Let me back up the truck and start again. A good number of students gravitate the courses in which these things are part of a course.
Mm-hmm.
They're featured, and they might be featured up front and center, or they might just be a part of the course along with other parts. But students do gravitate to them, so there is student interest. And I think for younger students, there's certainly interest on part of many parents to see that these things get taught. So at two different levels, primary school and even up through public high school, it's one thing. But there, parents can actually take charge. And we're seeing this happening in many places. It could continue to happen. And I think it's not going, people refer to this as culture wars, as if it's a battle going on. It is something of a battle, but I think parents will keep fighting. So at that level, I'm optimistic. At the college level, I'm optimistic because I see students still have interest in this. And what I think is key is, who are going to be the professors in colleges and the teachers in public schools in the next 2-3 generations. I think what's key is training, educating individuals who are committed to maintaining, to keeping a place in the curriculum for these subjects, and will actually push for the teaching of these things as teachers and professors, and actually teaching. So recruiting young people to do this is difficult because the teaching profession is one of the worst paid at all levels in the United States. At all levels. It's just ridiculous. Very little value is placed on it. So becoming a teacher involves some measure of, dedication, self-sacrifice, sense of commitment and purpose. It's like sometimes I've compared it to the Peace Corps. You have these idealistic young people who do this because they know it needs to be done. And because they like doing it too, right? But what they have to do is to overlook the fact that they're getting paid much less than a lot of the other people they know their age who have different kinds of jobs.
Especially if they go to grad school.
Yes. Well, that's, and when I was chair of Renaissance Studies at Yale, the administration kept pushing for the hiring of a more diverse faculty. And I kept trying to stress, and also the admission of more students that would make for a more diverse student body. I kept trying to explain to them that young people from disadvantaged backgrounds do not want to go to graduate school, do not want to make that commitment because they know the amount of time and effort that it takes and how relatively low their income is going to be. It's not a way to climb out of disadvantaged social status.
Yeah.
But they wouldn't listen to me.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. I mean, it's so you can't blame anyone for wanting to do something that'll give them more opportunities than this. I remember some good advice I got from my thesis advisor in undergrad. When I told him I wanted to go to grad school, he said, or I told him I wanted to be an English professor. He said, if you can see yourself doing anything else, do it. It's good advice.
Yes, the reverse is also true. If you can't see yourself doing something else, then do it. It's very true. It's what I always tell people who come in either wanting to go to graduate school or they're in the midst of trying to choose which major they want for their undergraduate degree. They just do what you love. That's what you love. That's what you love. But even 50 some years ago, when I was applying to graduate schools, I had many of my professors say, yeah, I'll write you a letter, but please don't do this to yourself. And what I think they had in mind was my refugee status more than anything else. Dentistry. There you go. That's one way to get out of the hole you're in right now. Accounting, whatever, finance, but not religious studies.
Well, I think if I had never read Milton, there might have been hope for me. I wanted to go to grad school before I read Milton, but I was interested in other things too. But when I read Milton, all of my friends and family know that there was a real conversion moment.
Wow.
After which, there was no hope for me. Like I said, I was gonna spend the rest of my life with this.
Yes. Yeah. Shortly before she died, my mom confessed to me that when I went off to graduate school at Yale, her friends converged in her small basement apartment, carry out an intervention.
For you?
Yeah, for me. You can't allow Carlos to waste his life this way. Be a good mother. Of course, this is Spanish culture is different. Parents can tell their grown children what to do. So that's why they did
I
this.
think my mom somehow didn't get the memo that that's just Spanish culture. He
So,
listens to this, so I'm gonna hear about this.
okay. Well, my mom was accosted by all her friends, and she basically said, you know, very politely, no, let him do what he wants to. And I appreciate that very much. She was never very happy with my choice until I was quoted in Time magazine. And it was her friends who called her attention to that. They kept calling her and said, oh, your son is being quoted in Time magazine. Then all of a sudden, all that bad stuff kind of, went away. So get yourself quoted in Time magazine.
I'm working on it. You'll help me. Maybe
Yes.
maybe you'll be my path to finally getting the validation.
I was asked to comment on a CBS miniseries on Joan of Arc.
Oh.
And I gave him a long review. The quote my mom was so proud of was, and it's the only thing they quoted from me, the horse costumes were great. Very important point. I thought it was, but it's not really what I had said. It was up front and center.
They say that each of us, if we're lucky, get one sentence in history. Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. You get
the horses got great costumes.
The horses had great costumes. Well, that's better than most of us. Most of us aren't in Time magazine at all.
Oh, you will give it time, or some other publication.
Thanks, Carlos. Well, this has been a true pleasure. I'm really glad that you donated your time to talk with me today.
My pleasure. It's not. I was going to say it's damn cold outside compared to where you are. There's no point in being outside though. It's kind of gloomy and chilly up here. And this is perfect.
It's a good day for a podcast.
Yes.
All right. Well, thanks, Carlos. I hope you enjoyed it, and who knows, maybe we'll have you back on sometime.
Immensely. You've cheered me quite a bit.